Hola, scholars. Today we are looking at our open educational textbook, which is Introduction to Ethnic Studies. I'm going to leave that book on the screen so you can see where I'm scrolling through and what areas I am talking about. We are reading chapter 7, which is at the bottom here. It says White Supremacy, Racisms, and Racial Formation. And one of the reasons we are reading that chapter right now is because it relates heavily to the textbook Racial Formation in the United States, which we have been reading and having activities in the class about. So I figure we can reinforce some of the concepts from that textbook before we move on to other areas related to ethnic studies. So the makeup of the book is really easy to follow. There's a way to download the entire text if you want to do that. And it's right up here at the front, in which it says you can download. It gives you different versions of files. You can even buy a print copy, but I'd rather you save your money. You can do a PDF as well, or you could just read it directly on your computer screen or phone. To access this link, you will need to go to our class webpage. And I think if I show you this other screen, I sent out an announcement about it. So you can click right here and you'll notice that we are taking a break from racial formations in the United States to just focus on this reading from the Open Educational Resource textbook. So if we start off in introduction, you're going to see that they jump right in with this idea of dehumanization and whiteness. And a very famous scholar, Paul Freire, wrote a book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And they're trying to tell you in this kind of intro why it's important to talk about white supremacy in an ethnic studies context and classroom setting, and that really what maintains the power about white supremacy is this idea that it is a natural category of identity when it's not. So a default to whiteness, I think that the authors give a good example here of how it can be difficult for white students in a class, and especially in an ethnic studies class, to understand racialization when their racialization process has been different. So it's just a good intro, just kind of whetting the tongue, so to speak, or your appetite to get into the heavier topics. Then we go into defining whiteness and white supremacy. So in order for something to lose its power, you have to name it. You have to call it out and you have to talk about it. And that's how we make changes in society. So you can see from the very first couple of sentences, our authors are mentioned right away. So Omni and Winnow define racial formation as a process in which racial identity is created and experienced. So that's what this entire textbook is about, is understanding how race and racial formation happened and how can we counteract it or understand it better, and how can we really fight notions of racism, right? And that's why it's so dense and it's so complicated, because if racism and racial projects were something really easy that we could get rid of in society, we would have already done it. Like there were many points historically where changes and advancements and new laws were being put into place, and yet this ideology remains embedded in our society, and specifically for in the benefit of one group over another. So they talk a little bit about othering, specifically with indigenous peoples, Africans, and slavery. That these terms, these charged descriptions of people as heathens, uncivilized, uh, this idea that someone needs to be taken care of by someone who knows better. These kinds of justifications were used to conduct some atrocious acts against these communities of color. And Omni and Winnow call these racial projects, which we have also talked about. The definition here, something identified as racial, whether having direct association to a group, a racial group, whether true or not, or even something like having a motive to designate something racially, is what they call a racial project. I believe that term, a racial project, might have been talked about in the very first introduction to the book. I should have noted so I could have you reference it. Um, but we've definitely talked about it. And I can also find it later. We can talk about it in class. But yes. So racial projects, in terms of whether something is racist and it reproduces racism, is important to understand when you're thinking of racial projects. So they do these little sidebars in the textbooks where they talk either about the images or they talk about a key example related to what is being discussed. And if you notice here, this one is related to the picture right above in order to understand what this graphic is showing. And it says, the children are deemed savages, and Uncle Sam is teaching the class. It portrays different places such as Cuba, Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, etc. as childlike and unruly. There is an actual book, The Forbidden Book, the Philippine American War and Political Cartoons, has a lot of these images that you could look at that talk about U.S. imperialism. And then imperialism as an attempt for one country to dominate another country's resources. And then they define white supremacy here. They use Batista Martinez's definition of white supremacy, promoting privilege and power of whiteness and for white people through institutional entities. A lot of individuals can sometimes get uncomfortable talking about white supremacy because it sounds very intentional, and individuals will say, well, I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm not intentionally being racist or promoting white supremacy by being, quote, white, but the naming of it, white supremacy, is to point out that whiteness is something that few people can benefit from unless they claim, quote, an assimilation and into this whiteness fold, and that it's not necessarily conducted on an individual. It can be, but it's really structurally, it's embedded in our very society's fabrics of how we can be successful and how we can live a good life and have enough resources. So they do point out some information about whether non-whites can invest in whiteness, and that is true. they can. Some of the terms I was thinking of from racial formations in the United States, racial projects and racialization, and those terms that they're referencing in 7.2, defining whiteness and white supremacy. They are talked about in our other textbook in chapter 4, the theory of racial formation, which we haven't yet talked about, but we will get into it in relation to this reading so we can combine efforts. So it talks about race, it talks about race making, it talks about othering. Racial projects is defined on page 125 under a subheading that's called racial projects. So this is a really important chapter that's kind of combining topics from this open educational book and other chapters we have read in racial formation. So that's why I wanted to highlight it. So if we move on to 7.3, racism as structural and institutional, this is what I was talking about when you think of white supremacy. It's how some people benefit over others in a systemic way in life. So they have a good quote right here at the very top. Pick any relevant sociological indicator: life expectancy, infant mortality, literacy, access to health, income level, and apply it virtually in any setting, global, regional, or local, and the results will be the same. The worldwide correlation of wealth and well-being with white skin and European descent, and of poverty and immiseration with dark skin and otherness. There are, of course, they say there are exceptions to this as well, but they are trying to show you the vastness of the impact that white supremacy can have in these systems of power, that if we don't critically think about it, we won't question this status quo, and we won't find a way to undo the damage, right? That colonization and imperialism, going to another country and taking over that country's lands, fighting wars for it. These are things that are very hard to dismantle if we're not talking about them. So in this section, they do talk about an investment in whiteness. George Lipsitz is the one who has coined the term possessive investment in whiteness. And I've talked about this a little briefly in terms of assimilation and some people or some communities being encouraged to become white because there's advantages to becoming white. And if you want to live a happier, more successful life, sometimes it's better to just go with that status quo. And here it is, status quo. And so what does it mean to fight against that standard? I did talk a little bit in class about housing covenants and the impact race has had to even being able to buy a house. And this is another aspect about it discussed in the sidebar here, which is redlining. So certain districts of housing deeds and ownership being marked as the least desired areas. And so when we think of segregation and, oh, well, segregation ended in the 60s, the late 60s. Remember, we had integration into schools and the white schools were forced to let Black or African American students in. Well, redlining still continues today. And when you have housing maps and areas in which specific sections are targeted as undesirable areas, those with income and wealth will move out. It's called a, quote, white flight. And so then you have a forced segregation occurring because those who do not move out from these areas or those that do not have the generational wealth to move to nicer neighborhoods. And redlining is definitely something you should read more about if you're interested. There's a really good textbook called The Color of Law that talks about redlining in our area. So this is Richmond, Oakland, right here, San Francisco, in the Bay Area. And it's written by a local scholar, and it's really frustrating to see how embedded it is even here in our community, our local community. So there's a little more discussion. I feel like we've talked a lot about color blindness rhetorics. They do go through some laws and some Supreme Court cases here related to when people are trying to fight these injustices or policies that are racist. I have mentioned the one drop rule. And I mentioned it in relation to our textbook because there is a single drop of blood going on to what looks to be a flag. And the one drop blood rule is known as an anti-miscegenation law. It was created in the 1600s, and it declared any person with a single drop of black blood to be black. And so I've also talked about the Loving v. Virginia case, which was a couple that was interracial that married, and then the black individual got arrested for it. And so it's not that far in the past. These things have been happening very recently, right? Within memories of our grandparents or lifetimes, or if our great grandparents are still alive. So it's really important to understand some of the laws. They do a discussion of the 3 I's of oppression: institutional oppression, interpersonal oppression, and internalized oppression. A quick summary: institutional is the one that I've been talking the most about, probably. Omni and Winnow also talk about it. It is the laws, policies, protocols, procedures. It is the structural points of oppression that are the most difficult to get rid of because they're so embedded in our everyday life. Interpersonal oppressions are those often associated with, so this first one is macro. The institutional oppression is macro. And then interpersonal oppression is about one-on-one. That's the individual microaggressions or micro aspects of life in terms of one individual being racist to another. And then finally, internalized oppression is when a person internally believes all the negative messages, stereotypes, and different media / messages they've been receiving about themselves. This is perhaps the most damaging of the types of oppression because it's hard to stop thinking a certain way if you've been taught your whole life that you don't matter. So, but I mean, you really need to understand all 3. And then they have a little discussion on ideology and hegemony. Ideology is a set of beliefs within a group. So if I believe, that marriage should happen first before sex, that is an ideology belief. And ideologies are different depending upon what groups you are talking to. And usually in ethnic studies, we're looking at ideologies that are spouted by elitist members in society and that are harmful to people of color. And they give a good example here of Barbie and whiteness being beautiful and normed. Okay, we are going on to 7.4, structural and institutional legacies of whiteness. I know I'm going a little slow. We still have normalization of whiteness, and then we have the summary. So this section really talks about why the structural institutions are set up in such a way so that only some benefit over others. And it's because of that, the power dynamics related to keeping communities of color disenfranchised. And the reason for that is because um, if they mobilize, it would be a way to dismantle the whiteness that we're talking about in institutions. And so they give an example here of blacks wanting to vote and keeping blacks from getting an education. One way of doing this, of course, is incarceration factors. That's definitely one way of keeping a community unable to advance or to do new things, is if you're constantly criminalizing them. So these are ways that whiteness is maintained. There's a little bit about epistemologies, which is, again, just kind of different theories of thought in school. It's a fancy word to say that. And if you click on it, I believe it would take you to a definition of it or a keyword. It has a clickable link. They talk a little bit about Althusser's ideological state apparatuses. Let me turn off these notifications. Okay. For institutions, and this can include newspapers, radio, television, hence why they have a picture of a news group. This is how you control information. If you control those that produce the information and you share false information, for instance, about critical race theory or about ethnic studies, that's how you maintain fear and white power or white supremacy as the base of a society. Talk a little bit about the boarding schools that occurred with Native peoples. It's one of the reasons why working in education can be so exhilarating, but also so um, depressing, because of this history of how education was used to dehumanize another group of people. And to be honest, education is still doing that. Depending upon where you go, there's forms of knowledge that are not taught and other forms that are lifted up and often made to make some people feel worse about who they are, or if school's not for them, or certain aspects about school. So, and here's an example in terms of Black children's personality traits, ability, language, behavior, and how teachers treat them. So you might think about your own school experiences and when did teachers lift you up and encourage you and say that you can do more than maybe you think you can, or say that you are just as smart as someone else or even smarter. Like, when did this encouragement happen, or did it happen? And if it didn't happen, what kinds of messages were you receiving? That is the examples of this, ideological state apparatus, like concretely presented in everyday interactions. I'm going to end on this section with the medicine, health, and STEM. We've talked a little bit about eugenics in class and forced mass sterilization. There will be a chapter on that. You can jump ahead if you're interested. It's scary to think how racism can be embedded in health and wellness, because it also determines physically who's able to live. So, and especially in terms of what kinds of healthcare you get. So I'm going to go ahead. There's some really interesting sidebars at the bottom about recent laws that have gotten into place that prevent the teaching of some of what we're talking about. I'm going to skip ahead to the normalization of whiteness because the lecture is getting pretty long because I talk a lot. And then we're on the summary. So normalization of whiteness. I wanted to bring this up because they talk about the doll test. And one thing I didn't really understand is why they didn't reference the sociologists who were involved in the doll test. So if you recall, in Racial Formation in the United States, at the bottom of page 35 to the top of 36, it talks about psychologist Kenneth B. Clark and not just Kenneth B. Clark, but his, here we go, collaborating with his wife, Mamie Phipps Clark. They were the two that did the Brown v. Board of Education. They presented the data about the children who would point out that the white dolls were beautiful. And this happened with Black children. And it brought up that internalized oppression, internal colonialism, the understanding that separate didn't mean equal and actually was harming these children's racial attitudes about themselves. And so that discussion, bottom of 35 into 36, is worth reading. And their names should really be mentioned here. The Clarks, Black psychologists working in the field at the time. So, racialization, that's talked about as well with our authors being referenced. And then, let's see if there's anything else. A sidebar on perpetual foreigners. So no matter how much you try to be, quote, U.S., or no matter how long you've been in the U.S., sometimes you are perpetually perceived as a foreigner based on how you look. And hence why some groups go to extremes to point out that they are proud U.S. citizens. And then there's some normalizations of whiteness. Oscars So White, when Academy Awards that are given are mainly to all the white actors. There was a discussion going on with Rihanna in the Country Music Awards, being a Black woman breaking, or it's not the first time she's done country music, but having the number one country song, and yet being denied an opportunity to receive a country music award. Eugenics again is being talked about here. It's just these issues in terms of how whiteness and standards of whiteness impact us culturally, through media, through what is determined as popular, through our very health and food and wellness and our voting rights and our laws. It hasn't changed as much as we would hope. So there's a lot of work still to be done. The summary, it's just a great way to categorize everything you learned. And they have the key terms here with their definitions. So when they have the clickable links, this is where it would take you to. So if you forget what was discussed, you can go here. There's some activities related to your understanding. And then, of course, they have their references page. So you can see where the knowledge was pulled from in case you want to go directly to a textbook to get information. And here is our textbook. Yay! So, and some of these you can click. They're clickable links, so you can see the source right away. So, I talked a lot. It was a really exciting chapter. I really hope you enjoyed it. Reach out on Canvas with any questions, and thank you all.